way you do that, if you've ever played Risk, which is what we're basically playing now, you
That's what we're
hold
playing.
your territory, and then you hold the borders of the other continent that the other team has, so that they don't basically have the set and get more powerful. I mean, it's that simple in board game terms. So you don't let Asia fall to China, because that will, in time, make them more important than you. Because rich as the Americas are together, Asia, more populous, can probably do far better, particularly given the industrial head start that China has now, which is huge and should never be underplayed.
Oh,
America has got
absolutely.
decades of catching up to do, but you don't allow that to then be reinforced by saying, and all of Asia is yours, losing Japan, losing South Korea, losing the Philippines, losing Taiwan, etc., etc. And in Russia's case, yeah, you try and basically back away from that and let Europe step up and do it, but you don't want Europe to roll over, because you don't want a Eurasian bloc, which ultimately can threaten you in the Atlantic on the other side. You just want Europe to do their bloody job and actually step up and actually be prepared to fight Russia if necessary, which, to be frank, they can't do at the moment. They're basically like a wet paper bag. Anything you put in just falls out the bottom. And I know that they're now talking about this big defense step up, and the European press are full of it. Yeah, and they are full of it, to use a different analogy, because it's 2035 before they actually get to that target. And it's a moving target. America has talked about increasing the defense budget by 50% next year. I don't think that will happen, but you can see what they're talking about. Russia is all in.
And just so people know what these numbers are, he's suggesting going from just under 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion per year. Now, rather than thinking of that just in budgetary terms, think of it compared to QE. At the height of QE, they were doing something like, 150 billion a month. And so over a 1 year period, that's $1.5–2 trillion. And that goes to the banks, who then have to take a second step of using that to provide new credit to push assets higher.
Which they didn't do.
which they didn't initially do, right?
Yeah.
This is basically the size of the QE programs, but it is going right into the economy immediately. There's no second step. And so I think that I just bring that up because the numbers are incredible, but it also speaks to the fact that the United States is not just going to roll over and become a second-class citizen on the world stage. How this ultimately plays out, I don't know for sure, but I know they're not just going to roll over and start giving away influence.
No, completely agree. So that's something, again, that needs to be absorbed and is rejected by far too many people, or is accepted, but then the plan itself is rejected. So you say, well, we get that, but we don't accept what America is doing. But what I think is really crucial here, and this is a theme I'm going to be exploring in more detail over the next couple of days. I hope to be publishing on it as soon as I can get it finished. I actually think that we're seeing some really interesting historical parallels right now. I like history. I like economic history.
Love it.
But it never repeats itself, but it rhymes, as Mark Twain famously said, and is quoted to death as having said. Yes, we're in a new Cold War. It's not like the last one because we're so integrated. Yes, there's a parallel with the pre-World War I period where deeply integrated economies ended up splitting and fighting each other. Yes, there's a parallel with the 1930s in terms of the domestic polarization that we're seeing and the rise of extremism on the far left and the far right the way around the world, which is, deeply, deeply disturbing and all part of this mess, because if you don't have political control, you don't get anything done. But where I think we see a really interesting parallel with the US, and this puts slightly more nuance in terms of the rather bullish position we're putting forward, because I am bullish, right? But I'm aware that there are risks. This is not a Hollywood movie where things are done in 90 minutes, explosion, done, thank you. It's not all like Maduro, right? There's a lot of harder things to take care of.
Real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to make a point real quick. I think this is important for people to understand. Is Michael and I, we actually think this can end up being bullish. You would a lot of people assume the fall of the liberal world order automatically means chaos and ash and ruin, and it's not that can't happen, but that's not. At least that's not. We may end up there eventually, but in my opinion, we could see growth and perhaps fantastic growth prior to that. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I kind of wanted to make that point. We're not sitting here necessarily predicting doom and gloom. Volatility,
No,
but not necessarily doom and gloom.
completely. In fact, I'm going to come back to that as part of the next thing that I want to say here now. So I'm going to shock a few people listening, I think, and stretch the memories of those who are younger. But Google is your friend, right? So get out there and use your AI, do some reading around it. I actually think there's a distinct parallel between where Trump is now and President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. And I say that.
Interesting. I know.
I say that because
going with this. Go ahead.
He inherited a superpower in 1985, and it was completely stagnant. The Soviet Union was a superpower. It was fantastic at producing military stuff. It was terrible at producing consumer stuff. They had a command economy which didn't have any issues with profitability because it didn't exist. It was basically do it. So talk about fiat, just do that. But they destroyed value with most of what they were making. But yeah, but they could flood the world Kalashnikovs with good, cheap tanks, with reasonable fighter jets, etc., etc. And they controlled around a third of the world's population. This was a serious foe for the US, a serious opponent. And you'd had periods of confrontation and, almost warfare, periods of proxy warfare, and periods of denial. But overall, of course, they were enemies. So Gorbachev comes in, and the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, appoint him because they recognize they need to reform. They need to move towards embracing consumer goods to keep people happy alongside the military goods. Now, I'm going to describe in the piece I put out in much more detail how the Soviet economy worked because I studied that.
This is why I love this. This is why I love talking to you. You go ahead.
Okay, well, I thought it was my sparkling personality.
No. This is great.
So basically, I'm not going to go into finite detail now because everyone will fall asleep. But the whole point is the system couldn't be reformed. They tried partial reforms. They didn't work. Then they had to accelerate them. And gradually, the system just collapsed. In fact, there was an attempted coup against Gorbachev with people saying, let's rewind the clock.
Yeah.
Because once you started to play around with the command economy and introduce market mechanisms to it, everything collapses. It's like a table where you need to change all four legs at once. But you can't do all four at once. So you take away one, the table falls over and you lose all your food. Okay. So it was a disaster. Then we got radical market reforms that came in and really decimated Russia. And that's a whole different story. But the Gorbachev era is prescient because what he was trying to do was introduce basically glasnost, which is radical transparency, and perestroika, which is reforms. Well, Trump is all about glasnost, freedom of speech. Everyone can say everything, even if it's offensive. It's a controversial political point, but there's a parallel there. And he is trying perestroika. He's trying to take a US economy, which is all about consumption, and make it more about the military.
It's reverse perestroika. It's reverse perestroika is what it is.
He needs to move towards a more command economy whilst not blowing up the consumer side. Now, again, I don't want to get into the intricacies of that, but the system works in reverse. For example, once you start saying, what is GDP for? You start asking, well, what's the Fed for? And that brings us to all the hoo-ha with Powell at the moment, okay? What are interest rates for? Who are they for? You start controlling everything and commanding everything, and then market forces can disappear and you go too far, right? So he has to make sure he doesn't blow the whole thing up the way that Gorbachev did. And if he does get it wrong, we can see that obviously people would like to get rid of Trump. You don't have to look too far to see people who would like to depose him or weaken him the way that Gorbachev was deposed in a coup, effectively. And things can fall apart, at which point, the bull case for America falls apart, I think, even if markets would rally to a degree short term. And other forces globally who are better at command economies and mixing that with a market economy. China, for example, has an incredibly powerful mixture of market forces and a command economy, which means that they can outproduce America 250 to 1 in terms of shipbuilding. 250 to 1. That's just mind-blowing, okay? So things can fall apart. But if he succeeds, then you have a very different American economy, which frankly offends a great deal of vested interests.
You have a much different global economy as well.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, this is the last point. I just want to bring it back to what you said about the growth. It's better for the consumer, ironically, because you get consumption based on income rather than borrowing. So the middleman who's lending to the consumer doesn't do well.